I endured bias throughout my life because of my golden child sister. Finally, I obtained my long awaited payback on my wedding day. My parents always preferred my sister, and it was glaringly obvious. If she blamed me for something, they'd take her word for it and punish me. But if I accused her, even with undeniable proof, they'd impose a lighter penalty on her and find a reason to reprimand me as well. My birthday cake always had to be her preferred flavor, and my parents pretended they were oblivious to my dislike for it. They consistently bought more for her than for me and took us to places of her choosing, even when it was supposed to be my time. My sister grew up pampered and used me as a punching bag. Initially, she largely ignored me, but things worsened as we entered our teenage years. She ended up with no friends, and her behavior spiraled. Whether her friends abandoned her because of her cruelty, I don't know, since we were never close. My parents praised her accomplishments, but never mentioned her shortcomings, while they constantly pointed out my flaws to mock me. I only realized she had no friends because we attended the same school, and I noticed she was no longer socializing with anyone. Meanwhile, I was relatively popular. My sister eventually took note of this and shifted from occasional bullying to continuously trying to bring me down. She began accusing me and my friends of various things, and my parents stopped letting me hang out with anyone, offering excuses like, "They're not good people, according to your sister," or "Why are you trying to leave us? Why can't you be like your sister and enjoy family time?" What kept me from complete isolation was my extended family. Most of them lived in our hometown, and I got along well with my cousins, despite some age gaps. During one gathering, they invited me somewhere, but I sadly informed them I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. When asked why, my young self bluntly explained that it was because I wasn't permitted to have friends, since my sister didn't have any. This information got back to the adults, who apparently confronted my parents. Later, I was reprimanded for lying and grounded for a month, but after that, they gave me more freedom, which made it worth it. My sister switched schools, likely due to the humiliation of having our extended family aware of her social status. She demanded to transfer, and my parents quickly agreed, despite the added expense of the new school being farther away. She made friends at the new school, but she continued to largely ignore me. Her behavior worsened as she felt empowered to torment me, and she remained angry at me for revealing to the family that she had no friends. She didn't let me go easily, and my life remained difficult. Her friends came over to bully me, which my parents labeled as harmless teasing. I never invited anyone over because my parents were terrible hosts, or my sister would accuse them of stealing, and my parents would always believe her. I did manage to grow close to my cousins, though, since my parents never dared to treat family in such a way. Then came my first boyfriend. I didn't want to bring him home, but my parents insisted. At one point, we were separated, and he came to find me to say that my sister was flirting with him. She came over in revealing clothes, batting her eyelashes, and began telling him how bad I was and how much better she was. He was annoyed and ran off to find me. Of course, my sister told my parents a completely different story, claiming that my boyfriend had tried to flirt with her, but she had turned him down because she couldn't do that to me. Guess who my parents believed? My boyfriend wasn't perfect, but I immediately trusted him for a petty reason. Keep in mind, I was a teenager suffering from unfair treatment, filled with resentment and a bad mood, and I hated my sister just as much as she hated me. Now, let's talk about appearances. I hadn't mentioned them yet because they weren't important, but here we go. My parents were overweight and expressed love through food, buying more food, treats, etc. My sister was also overweight, while I wasn't. I've always been somewhat thin, partly because punishments often involve depriving me of treats or snacks. Of course, weight doesn't matter. Character does. But my sister was already rude and entitled. Even her attempts at flirting were awkward because she'd never learned to earn anything, as she simply demanded, and my parents would comply. Adding to that, she wasn't exactly a sexy model type. Even my self-conscious teenage self didn't believe my boyfriend would try to cheat on me with her. My parents forbade me from dating such a terrible guy. I did try to continue seeing him secretly, but it was hard, and the relationship eventually ended. I later had another boyfriend, but again, My sister accused him of flirting with her when he rejected her advances. Once again, my parents believed her. I tried pointing out that this situation was repeating, but they just claimed that I was incapable of making good decisions and kept choosing the wrong boyfriends. The relationship couldn't survive the constant Romeo and Juliet like drama and ended. I eventually got labeled as promiscuous in high school since I was okay with making out with boys, but refused to have serious relationships. Thankfully, it never got back to my sister or parents. During this time, my sister brought one boyfriend home, and he was treated like royalty. My parents constantly praised him, telling me how great he was and how I should find someone like him. But then he stopped showing up, and suddenly, he was a deceitful jerk who had tricked my sister. And so the unequal treatment persisted. By this time, she had more pocket money, and her curfew was much more lenient than mine. She could go anywhere at any time, while I couldn't. If I pointed this out, my parents would say it was because she was older. But when I reached the same age, I didn't get the same treatment. When I brought it up, they denied ever saying that and claimed it was because I wasn't as trustworthy as she was, using her accusations against my boyfriend and friends as evidence of my poor judgment. Time passed, and it was time for my sister to graduate. She was accepted into a college, not a prestigious one, and didn't have a scholarship or anything. Since only her achievements were discussed with me, I don't know which colleges she even applied to, so I can't say how badly she was rejected. However, I do know her grades were poor because every time she received a B, we would celebrate. I generally received good grades, but my parents never celebrated, claiming that since I always got good grades, there was nothing to celebrate. My parents made a big deal of her acceptance and told her they'd pay for everything. I felt a sense of relief that she would be leaving, although it didn't make my life any easier. She still came home every other weekend, and somehow, things from my room kept disappearing, or some other problem would arise to make my life miserable. My curfew remained strict. Eventually, my mother sat down with me to discuss my impending graduation. I was only 1 year younger than my sister. She told me that because they were paying for my sister's college, they wouldn't have the money to pay for mine, so it would be better for me to start working right after graduation and wait until my sister finished university to see if they could afford anything for me. Oh, and if I decided to stay at home, I'd have to pay for everything myself, my own expenses, part of the bills, and rent. I pointed out that I could take out student loans. My mom agreed, but then said no because they were so concerned about me and my bad judgment that they would decide if the college was worth going into debt for. I'm not sure how they would stop me from getting loans, but I didn't ask. Scholarships weren't mentioned. They had no idea what my grades were anymore and had never believed in my abilities. I didn't react. I simply said, okay. My mom clearly didn't expect that response and kept crying, perhaps hoping I would throw a tantrum, giving them an excuse to never pay for my education. I simply replied that I understood their stance, thanked them for their concern, and that was the end of it. My father later attempted the same approach, but I again rejected any emotional involvement. You see, after enduring a lifetime of their dreadful parenting, I no longer had any expectations regarding my education. I knew they would come up with an excuse to avoid funding my education and make my life difficult. I never believed they would eventually pay if I worked hard and waited for my sister to finish her studies. I had been preparing for college for quite a while. My social circle was minimal, so I had plenty of time to focus on my studies, and I saw college as my only chance at freedom. When the moment arrived, I worked relentlessly and earned a scholarship, though not to an Ivy League school or anything prestigious like law or medical school. It was a decent program at a respectable college, and I had a full scholarship. Knowing that my sister would resent this and attempt to stop me through my parents, I shared my success on social media. At the same time, I even forced myself to thank them publicly in the post. This way, they couldn't forbid me from going, as they would have to explain it to the rest of the family. Initially, they were somewhat proud and even boasted about it, but then I suppose my sister influenced them, and they changed their stance. They began questioning whether I was certain I wanted to go. They casually mentioned that my sister wasn't faring well at college, and since she was perceived as more intelligent and had better judgment, I would face even more challenges. I stuck to my decision, unwavering. They weren't thrilled, but had no choice. College became my escape. I started to feel happiness. I kept in touch with my parents and visited during holidays, but since they refused to contribute financially, I used money as an excuse to avoid visiting too often. During this period, I avoided introducing any men to them, and my sister eventually dropped out of college. I know she didn't graduate because, had she, they would have made a big deal out of it. She moved back home, paying no rent or bills. However, things were different now. My parents said she started working at the same company as my mother, thanks to my mother's influence. They presented it to me as a point of pride. Around this time, I met my husband. You know those people who say, if I were in that situation, I would have done something? My husband is the type who actually acts. I'm the type who is passive and lets things happen, then regrets it later, wishing I had done or said something clever. I cry when I'm angry. My husband, on the other hand, is the type who responds immediately. He loves drama and conflict and is quick to resolve it. If he doesn't immediately react to an offense, you'd better start worrying because he won't forgive easily. Instead, he'll plan something worse for revenge. He encouraged me to share our story here and even wanted to post on a revenge board, but ultimately decided that what we did wasn't severe enough for that. People were surprised that I ended up with him, but just because I couldn't act like him due to my upbringing didn't mean I didn't admire his approach. I love that my husband does things I can't, and he treats others well as long as they reciprocate. When we talked about marriage, we decided that the ceremony itself wasn't important due to budget constraints. We'd rather spend that money on a dream honeymoon in Europe. We also decided to hold the wedding in my hometown as his family was scattered and mine was mostly there. We weren't too far from it, so weekend trips were manageable and there was some work flexibility, allowing us to stay for a while if necessary. We sent out the engagement announcement and saved the date cards for a few months later. Naturally, my parents insisted on meeting my fiancé. I wanted to be firm and refuse, but I found it difficult. The distance had made me reconsider, and I began to think that maybe my parents weren't as bad as I had believed. However, my husband looked like I had canceled Christmas when I told him I would at least make sure they would never be alone with him. He had been preparing for this meeting. He even bought a high-quality recorder to hide in his pocket to capture everything. He was excited, imagining all the ways he could reject my sister's advances, insult her, and then share the recording with the rest of the family. He went to meet them, eager for the encounter. When he came back, he was ecstatic. Babe, babe, you won't believe what they said. We can totally get back at them now, he said. I was confused and wanted to hear the recording, but he wisely told me to listen to his version of events first, or I might misunderstand him. He explained that, instead of hitting on him, my parents and sister had sat him down and, after some grumbling about not approving of him, declared that they were willing to help pay for the wedding, but only if my sister could walk down the aisle first in a wedding dress. They argued that it wasn't right for the younger sister to marry first, and that it would only be fair for my sister to have the experience of walking down the aisle, wearing the dress, and having photos taken at my wedding, even having a cake afterward. My husband then decided to respond in his usual dramatic way. He recounted how my parents tried to manipulate the situation, all while maintaining a grin. I was shocked. The distance had softened my perception of how badly they had treated me, and I couldn't believe they would go that far. Thankfully, my husband's insistence on revenge helped me avoid getting caught in a negative mindset. We brainstormed different ways to get back at them, ranging from ridiculous to somewhat feasible. Eventually, we contacted his more level-headed brother to discuss the plan. We agreed on a scheme that involved giving them two different venue addresses, with one being incorrect. However, his brother scolded us, acknowledging that while he couldn't convince us to avoid retaliation, he pointed out that such a plan could be difficult to pull off and even risky in terms of legal consequences. In the end, we decided on a simpler, more harmless plan. pretend to go along with their demands, but hire security to stop my sister from attending. This was, of course, just the beginning of our revenge. Most of the execution was handled by my husband, but he wanted me to share the details. It's important to mention that everything he did was discussed with me, and we had come up with the ideas together. He went back to my parents, pretending to be on their side. He told them that he thought I wouldn't be on board with it, but assured them that, in the interest of keeping the family united, he'd be willing to go along with their demands. He emphasized that I didn't like conflict, so I might not confront them publicly, but marriage was a big deal, and who knew how I'd react? He suggested a compromise. They'd help pay for the wedding, making me feel even more pressure not to protest. He claimed my parents were shocked, and my grown sister literally skipped with joy like a child when they accepted. My husband also claimed that, due to poor past relationship decisions, the blame for all of this was actually mine, and I take great pride in using their words against them. I was distrustful and controlling, often checking his phone to make sure he wasn't cheating on me. It was crucial that no part of this scheme was ever documented, especially regarding my sister walking down the aisle before me. He would go over to their house to discuss the matter, and so began the months of deception. My parents and sister believed they were outwitting me, while my husband and I were taking advantage of them. Rather than paying for the wedding, they remained discreet. Naturally, my parents wanted a say in everything, including matters that were particularly important to me, such as the songs and the color scheme. My husband would persuade them to let it go, keeping me in check. However, since we never had a strong interest in the ceremony to begin with, everything else was open for manipulation, or so they believed. Here's what we did. We'd visit venues to review drink and menu options, always opting for the cheapest or second cheapest choices. My husband would secretly take my sister there to try them, then express regret, claiming that we didn't want to take advantage of my parents' generosity, so we'd settle for less. This would prompt my sister to demand that my parents cover the cost of the best options. My parents, eager to help, would then insist they'd pay for the most expensive choice. We followed the same approach with the photographer and flowers. My husband handed my sister a bouquet of the flowers we wanted, and then lamented that I preferred some tasteless options, which led my parents to offer to pay for the flowers they'd chosen. When it came to the wedding dress, we encountered a slight hurdle. My parents wanted me to wear an awful dress. Well, not entirely dreadful, but certainly not my style, and it wouldn't suit me. Our plan was to accept it and then not use it, but my mom sent me a message about it for proof. I had to refuse and stand my ground. My husband went over there to negotiate, and my sister even suggested ruining my chosen dress so that I'd be forced to wear the other one. He pretended to agree. Throughout this time, we made sure all communications were outside of text messages, ensuring that nothing could be traced. Whenever my sister tried texting my husband, I'd reply instead, reinforcing the narrative that I was controlling and neurotic, which made them believe it and kept things off the record. Some people might not be comfortable with the idea of their partner speaking poorly about them to family, but I found it amusing. The thought of being painted as the overbearing, dangerous one was hilarious to me, and I encouraged him to go along with it. I guess I have a twisted sense of humor. Oh, and my sister did attempt to flirt with him, but he acted torn, further selling the story. My husband would pretend to divulge things to my family without my knowledge, but he never revealed that we'd hired security. It was all so amusing. Despite originally considering a courthouse wedding to save money for our honeymoon, my husband and I ended up having an extravagant, costly wedding and barely spent a cent. We called it payback for the emotional toll from my parents. My husband, well, he was thoroughly enjoying the ruse more than the actual wedding planning. I didn't think it was possible to see someone so excited about wasting a whole Saturday driving to discuss wedding details with his in-laws, but here we were. Finally, the big day arrived. The plan devised by my parents, sister, and husband was to wait until everyone was seated. Since the bride is always expected to arrive last, they would have my sister walk down the aisle at the precise moment to keep me from seeing her and interfering. By the time I learned of what happened, it would be too late to do anything. Regarding my dress, we kept some leftover fabric from its alterations, which my husband took to my parents' house. He showed them as proof that the dress had been ruined, then claimed he had to leave to calm me down, as I was furious. He assured them he'd meet them at the wedding. We ensured our real security was initially hidden among the guests. Only after my parents had settled in did we reveal the actual security, a man who looked like a bodyguard. We instructed him not to let my sister in and promised him a generous tip for keeping it confidential. The moment arrived when my parents received a text saying my sister was only 5 minutes away, so my dad signaled for the ceremony to begin. The bridesmaids had been briefed to follow his lead, and they did so without consulting me. After they took their places, my dad stood at the entrance waiting for me. A friend, not part of the wedding party, texted me to get ready, just to avoid suspicion in case my husband or bridesmaids started texting. This friend, just as eager to stir things up, didn't mind not being a bridesmaid. When my dad took his position, the bridal music started. The doors opened, and I walked in. My dad was shocked to see me and tried to peer behind me, but couldn't see the entrance from where we were. He had no idea what had happened to my sister until his phone rang. I saw the caller ID. It was her. He left me with a mumbled excuse, and confusion filled the room. The friend, following our plan, loudly asked what had happened, and I lied, tearfully claiming my dad had told me it wasn't supposed to be me. My husband and I had agreed that if my dad abandoned me, I should say this to make him look as bad as possible. The tears weren't just for show. I was genuinely hurt and fighting to hold them back. The friend then loudly asked, "What did he mean by it wasn't supposed to be you?" ensuring everyone heard and would gossip. She then ran off to check on things. This chaos was all planned. She was to create confusion with security and prevent my dad from coming back to stop the ceremony. Eventually, my mom also left. At this point, my husband's dad rushed to me. He'd been warned he might need to step in, and his swift arrival made me smile. I walked down the aisle amid whispers as guests discussed the situation. Some left to investigate, but when I reached my husband, everything was fine. He comforted me, joking that my upset expression was so convincing, I deserved an Oscar. He reassured me that he'd take care of my parents for what they'd done. We got married without further issues. My parents never returned, and I noticed many people leaving and coming back during the reception. No one dared to tell me what was going on. Someone whispered something in my husband's ear, and he left. When he returned, his expression was thunderous, but he whispered to me that he needed to go hide before he broke character and started grinning. It worked. Here's a synopsis based on the feedback I gathered from friends, family, the security personnel, and my spouse later. My sibling showed up wearing a bridal gown. The security team, as we had agreed upon, stopped her from entering. They informed her that she must have the incorrect venue since there was already a bride present. Yes, we generously tipped them as promised. My father attempted to intimidate the security by threatening to call law enforcement, claiming he'd never seen the guard before, and questioning his legitimacy. The guard calmly agreed to involve the police, emphasizing that he was simply fulfilling his duty, as contracted by us. Realizing that calling the authorities would waste too much time, my father shifted to demanding that my sister be allowed entry. At this juncture, one of our friends intervened, shouting and berating my sister while causing a scene. It was a calculated delay tactic. Shortly after, my mother arrived, followed by others, and by then, the wedding plan had gone haywire. All my parents could do at this stage was damage control, as attendees who learned of their scheme were appalled. The three of them, my parents and sister, attempted to defend themselves, claiming it was never meant to be a clandestine act. They even accused my husband of being complicit. When he was called over, my husband feigned bewilderment and vehemently denied everything. To quote him, "Gaslight, gatekeeper, girl boss," followed by a laugh. He demanded evidence when they continued to assert he had agreed to the plan. Unsurprisingly, they had none. Every text message they could produce was about ordinary wedding arrangements. Meanwhile, my sister was throwing a tantrum, crying, and reportedly sitting on the floor, flailing her legs like a child. My father appeared furious enough to strike my husband, but was restrained by the security team and others present. Naturally, they claimed the absence of proof was because my husband had instructed them not to document anything via messages. My husband chuckled and responded sarcastically, "How convenient." He proceeded to chastise them, calling them terrible parents, and announced he wouldn't let their absurd antics destroy our wedding. Then he turned and rejoined me. No one believed their story. Although the venue had surveillance cameras, the recordings were strictly for security use and not accessible to us. However, some guests had recorded parts of the commotion. Watching my family face public humiliation after years of them accusing me of baseless things felt like sweet justice. It was undoubtedly one of the finest wedding gifts I could have received. My mother was in tears, my father's face alternated between purple and pale, and my sister remained hysterical on the ground. When interrogated about their motives, they failed to provide satisfactory answers about why my sister needed to disrupt my wedding or why my husband would ever agree to such a ludicrous scheme. They were eventually escorted out, with my father having to drag my sister, who refused to budge from the floor. Surprisingly, throughout the evening, no one mentioned the ordeal to me. I suspect they wanted to spare me, or perhaps because I was the bride. People made an extra effort to ensure the celebration remained cheerful and supportive. The reception was splendid, with excellent food and beverages, and my husband eventually abandoned his mock scowl for genuine smiles. Afterward, we retired to our hotel to rest before embarking on our honeymoon. While my parents had offered to pay for our flight tickets, we declined, suspecting they might attempt to cancel them later. It turned out to be a wise choice. Since then, my parents and sister have tried reaching out to me. Following my husband's advice, I ignored their calls, keeping a documented trail instead. Eventually, my sister sent a series of unhinged messages, blaming me for her humiliation, calling my husband deceitful, and even suggesting he had been unfaithful with her, of all people. My husband promptly took my phone, captured screenshots of the messages, along with call logs and messages from my parents, and shared them in our family group chat. He also included evidence of threats sent to him and warned them against harassment. In the group chat, he made an emotional appeal asking my extended family to intervene and prevent my parents and sister from further ruining our honeymoon after their failed attempt at sabotaging our wedding. He humorously mentioned the absurdity of them potentially showing up at our honeymoon suite. Thankfully, our family assured us they'd handle the matter, and peace has prevailed since. While my husband admits disappointment at my sister's lack of defiance, which would have allowed him to confront her again, he is content with how the situation unfolded. While I would have preferred a normal, supportive family on my wedding day, for once, their antics didn't overshadow my happiness. Instead, they faced the consequences of their actions, making it a day I'll never forget. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments.